I live. I breathe again. For not only has Alien Biospheres Part 13 finally been vanquished after a long and troubled production period, but at long, long last, the end is finally in sight. And I know most people who watch these Conlanging videos don't care about Alien Biospheres that much, and that's completely fine, I don't blame you. But I have been waiting for this next episode for years now, pretty much ever since the series began, and I am so unbelievably hyped that we are finally here. And in fact, in light of this, I'm not going to say anything definitive just yet, because I still have a few decisions to make about this, but I think I am going to go ahead and accelerate the plan slightly, just because it has always been a priority to get Alien Biospheres finished as soon as possible. And now that the end of the series is within sight, I kind of just want to power through it and get it done. And then after it's finished, I think everything will just be a lot better off for everyone. Again, I don't want to say anything too definitive, but at the very least, it'll mean that I can stop making these ludicrously long, hour-long videos that take so many months to make. But anyway, all in good time. We'll just have to see how that goes. Whatever the case, though, I will continue to produce these Conlang case study videos in the meantime, just because they are so quick and easy to make in comparison. And thank you once again to all of the patrons who have stuck with me through these long months that I've been stuck in production hell. As always, I am immensely appreciative of your support, and will continue to do my best to make it worth your while, and hopefully pick up the pace a little bit so you don't have to wait such long gulfs of time between videos. Right then, back to where we left off. So, although I've been majorly preoccupied with spec bio stuff in the last few months, I've continued to occasionally jot down ideas for phonological forms for words. And so now, as you can see, we've got quite a decent list of forms here. I've just bolded the ones that I think are particularly nice. So I think we can start to go ahead and flesh out this language's lexicon a bit more, because we're still rather short on words up to this point. But before that, just a few items of follow-up. So number one, with this directional applicative here, I'd originally had the form rila with a final vowel there, but I realized that if that were the case, then if this prefix got attached to any word that began with any consonant that didn't have vowels lost between it and a liquid, then that vowel would remain there, so it would come out as ila. And just in an attempt to save precious syllables, I realized that L is a valid coda at all stages of the language, so if we just change that to ril, then that would mean the prefix always surfaces as just il. Just makes the whole thing a little bit neater and more compact. That means we have to change the verb itself, but that's fine. That just results in a change in the second principal part. It used to be ilar, but now it's ilur. And I think in terms of the etymology, the more I think about it, the more I like the idea that it comes from to see. I just think that's a cool derivation. To have a phrase like, I give seeing the man, go on to mean, I give to the man. Not the best example, but you know what I mean. Now, I still don't know if this is actually going to linger in the modern language as a full-fledged verb in its own right, or whether it'll only exist in compounds or as part of derivations, etc. Also, I apparently decided to change the vowel in the first-person inclusive back to a proto-U, because originally it was a U, and then at some point I changed it to an A because I liked it better, but apparently since then I've changed it back to a U, and I honestly cannot remember why. Okay, well, I'm just going to roll with it and assume I had a good reason for it. I've also changed around the interrogatives a little bit. I just felt like or not was just so much stronger of a source for a typical yes-no question, but I liked having the final T, so I changed it to now the old word for or is hotu, and then with the negative particle U stuck at the end, that eventually shortens up into it, and that is now going to be the standard interrogative ending. And again, it's immune to harmony, because it was just a clitic by the time that vowel harmony actually happened. So you just stick it onto the end of any of the auxiliaries and you're fine. And then I changed the word for thus or so to this assa form, which then gives us this us ending, which I'm gonna just call a conjectural or rhetorical for the time being. And I don't think we'll need any additional interrogative forms other than these two. And the other thing was, last time I realized that with the sound changes that we had written, the only valid word initial cluster that we had was an obstruent followed by V, because W fortified to V following obstruents, including word initially. And it just felt kind of weird to me that that very specific cluster was the only cluster that was allowed to appear word initially. And I decided that the simplest way of resolving that would just be to say that the W fortifies to a V before initial and final clusters are broken up. And specifically, I do actually quite like the aesthetic of the consonant followed by V cluster for this language. Something like atfa, I think, is quite a nice cluster to have. So unlike with the final clusters, where we're actually breaking the clusters apart with an epenthetic vowel between them, I'm thinking that for initial clusters, we add an initial prothetic, if that's the right word. Prothesis is adding a vowel at the front, right? I'm pretty sure that's right. Well, whatever the word is, we add a vowel to the beginning of the word so that the cluster goes from being word initial to word internal. Like what happens quite a lot in Spanish with initial ST clusters. Also happens a lot in Nakachti. In the transition from Proto-Thracian to Nakachti, a whole bunch of words had an initial I vowel appended to them to break up the now illegal clusters. There's one very common change in Nakachti verbs. One of the common irregularities between the short and long stem is that the short stem will have an initial I vowel, and then the long stem, the I vowel will disappear and will be replaced by the reduplicated syllable that comes after it. So like the word for to love is iplamis, I think. And you'd think the long form would be iplamis with a lengthened initial vowel, but that initial vowel is just epenthetic, so the long form is actually peplamis, where the E that used to follow that internal P now gets preserved in the reduplicated stem. Anyway, in this case, I'm thinking that just like with breaking up the word final clusters, with word initial epenthesis, it'll just be using the underspecified low vowel, whose fronting and rounding is determined by the vowels in the stem. And for the last bit of follow-up, I've been thinking more about how I want to handle the causative. And to be honest, I still really don't know what the best way of doing it is. However, purely by coincidence, I came across something in Kinyarwanda, where apparently the causative and the instrumental applicative are identical to each other. So the way it works is there is a single affix, which I believe is of the form ish, which is pretty obviously a cognate with the causative in Swahili. So let's say you said something like, I write, with this ish marker on the end, child, letter. So if the direct object of the verb is animate, then the ish marker is interpreted as a causative. So in this case it would mean, I make the child write the letter. But if the object is inanimate, like if we took the same sentence and replaced child with pencil, now the ish is interpreted as an instrumental applicative. So it would mean, I use the pencil to write the letter. And you can kind of see how that would happen, because in both cases, the object is the thing that you're essentially using to accomplish whatever the verb is. They're sort of extensions of the same idea. I've heard of things like this happening in some other languages as well, where there's some sort of overlap going on between the causative and applicative. But in this case, it seems like they're totally interchangeable, and how it's interpreted is just contingent upon the animacy of the object, which I think is really cool, and it opens up the possibility for us of maybe the causative, at least the derivational causative, maybe it could come from a reanalyzed applicative. Because it is also worth mentioning that Kinyarwanda does have other causative strategies. It has periphrastic causatives too. You can use verbs that essentially just mean to make or to cause, whereas this ish thing is mainly a derivational sort of thing, as far as I understand it. And that's kind of the same thing that I'm wanting to pull off here as well, where the main reason why I want to have an actual causative affix in the first place is just because I find that incredibly useful when it comes to derivation. It's just so convenient to be able to take a word like to die and then just slap a causative on it and now you have to kill. Or take a word like to see and put the causative on it and now you have to show. It's just really easy to generate new verb meanings like that. So one option would just be to do what Kinyarwanda does and essentially have the causative just be identical to the instrumental applicative, which in our case we're just calling a circumstantial applicative. But the issue I can see there is, let's say we were saying something like, I die, and then we put the applicative on it to transitivize it, and then man as the object. So for the causative interpretation, that would mean, I kill the man. Or I guess more literally, it would be like, I die take the man. Something like that. Whereas if we do the same thing, except we say, I die applicative sword, then that, with the instrumental meaning, would mean, I die by the sword, or by means of the sword, or I experience death by sword. Now, even though it doesn't look like it in this translation, this would be a transitive verb. It would be a single verb that means to use something to die. So between these two examples, even though we're using exactly the same affix, in the first one the object is the thing that's dying, and in the second one it's the subject that's dying. That seems kind of confusing to me. I don't know how Kinyarwanda handles that. And then there's the even bigger issue of, can you combine these different meanings? Can you do something like, I killed the man with the sword? Yeah, that seems a bit unwieldy. That makes me think that what I might do is have the causative come from what used to be a fourth applicative. Maybe something that started out as more of an instrumental type thing, but then got reanalyzed as a causative, and then the circumstantial took over the instrumental meaning and became more of a general use applicative. I don't know, I think I might have to do some more reading on that. It's rapidly becoming clear that the hardest part about this language is definitely the valency system, which I kind of knew was going to be the case anyway, but I suspect that it's going to be quite tricky once we get to actually figuring out how all these things interact with the detransitive and the impersonal passive and all of the other stuff that we've got going on. And while we're on the subject, the other thing that would imply is that if the causative is just an applicative, then that would change up the way these case roles worked, because presumably the causative would apply these same cases that the other applicatives do, in the sense that the causee would be the direct object, and therefore it would be marked in the accusative, whereas the original direct object, the thing that the causee is acting upon, would be reintroduced with an adpositional phrase. So it would be like the opposite of what we have down here. I suspect I'm going to need to play around a lot more with that and do some more research before I make any firm decisions. Before we do that, though, I'd like to actually start assigning some meanings to these different forms we have. So all the ones that I have in bold are verbs, but I've picked out some that we could also use for postpositions, just based on the phonology of the form. They just lend themselves well, I think, to having postpositions derived from them. Because remember, we're going to have postpositions that derive from verb roots. And also with these two, I've roughed them in as potentially being verb roots to use for possessive classifiers. And I've already filled them out here with their potential forms. So one word that I would quite like to have is just a very semantically weak verb that means something like just to do, or to make, or to accomplish. So we could use either of these for that meaning, because the idea is that it could be used as a possessive word for nouns of possession by, I don't even really know what the word would be, but for things like accomplishments, something that is possessed by achievement, I guess. So if you, for example, take lessons in, I don't know, creative writing, if you wanted to say my creative writing lesson, that would be the creative writing lesson I do. Or if you had completed some project, like if you wrote a book, if you're saying, this is my book, in the sense that it's your book that you yourself wrote, then you would say, this is the I make book. We'll just call that accomplishment for now. I think I'm going to go with this nama form, for the sole reason that the marker form looks too similar to the word make. So this verb nama would therefore mean to do. Excellent. So we can use the marker form for something else, but before we do that, I did see some comments on the last episode of people suggesting that we use to know as one of these possessive classes, possibly replacing this word to say for the speech class. And I do quite like that idea of using to know for more sort of abstract ideas. Now, one thing about the word to know is that it often comes from an older word that means to see. And in general, there's often some polysemy between to know and to see. Like how in English you can say I see to mean I understand. And we do already have an older word for to see that gives rise to the directional applicative. So maybe, by the time of the modern language, what used to mean to see, again, assuming it actually survives as an independent word, can now mean to know or to understand. Now, we could use this verb as the basis for the possessive classifier that derives from to know, but if we didn't want to make it so transparently related to the word for to know, then we could say that the classifier actually came from an older word that meant to know in the proto-lang, that then this word that used to mean to see has since replaced. And in fact, that, I think, would make more sense, because the possessive classifiers are derived from a time when subject marking on independent verb forms was still a thing. So they predate the whole auxiliary verb construction stuff. And so the meanings that they have preserved in the classifiers would derive from before that point. So they would probably be associated with older meanings. And in fact, thinking about it now, another very common pathway is for words that mean to know to become words that mean can or to be able to. So what if the older word for to know that this word has now replaced survives only as the possessive classifier and also as essentially the ablative marker, or some construction that conveys the sense of to be able to. Now, I have not yet 100% decided exactly how I want ability to be marked. It may well just occur as an affix on either the auxiliary or the lexical verb, which requires exploring a whole bunch of other stuff of how multi-verb constructions actually work before we can figure out exactly how that would be reified. So I don't want to get into that just yet, but I do quite like that pathway. So I think I'm going to save marker for now, just in case that does end up being the word that we use for to know. But on the flip side, if the old word for to see is becoming the new word for to know, then we need another word to replace the meaning of to see. We do have this verb to sense or to glean that we used for the evidential. Something like that could work. The meaning fits, and it's quite short as well. And obviously to see is going to be a very common verb, so we'd probably expect it to shorten up, even if it started out as something a bit longer. That fits well enough that I think I might go with it for now. Really, the only reason I hesitate is just because I just like some of these forms better. But that's not hugely important. I'll just think about that and come back to it. So now I'm turning my attention towards these forms that have potential postpositions attached, because we have barely any postpositions in this language thus far. We've mainly just been relying on case endings to convey postpositional meanings. So the ones that immediately come to mind are from, which will probably come from a verb like to leave, to or toward, could be from something like go, and then with or by means of, the instrumental, could come from to use. And I suppose for, like a benefactive, could come from to give. But then I'm still thinking of potentially having to give be involved with the causative. So I want to leave that one alone while I'm still figuring out how I want that to work. I'm not sure if we'll actually need a general locative, something that means at, in, or on, because we do have a dedicated case for that, although it used to be just the accusative. So the accusative came from some very old, very basic adposition that meant something like to or at, whereas the genitive came from, which is now the accusative. So that raises the possibility of, let's say we had an adposition derived from go. That might mean that if the noun that was the dependent of the adposition was in the accusative, that would have the meaning of go to whatever it is, so the adposition would mean toward, whereas if the noun was in the genitive, then it would be go from whatever the noun is, so then the same adposition would mean away from. Kind of like the preposition in Latin, which has like 4 or 5 different meanings depending on which case you combine it with. I'm also cognizant of the fact that these forms that are giving rise to adpositions may not make it into the modern language as independent verb forms as well. I just realized that if this form actually began with an I rather than a Y, it's going to need a long vowel in there. Otherwise the I will be stressed, and therefore it won't turn into a glide. And that means we're going to need a long vowel in these forms as well. So I'm thinking that this form, if it did mean something like to go, I think it would be very easy to justify it compounding with other verbs to create new verb meanings. So even if this didn't survive into the modern language as an independent form, it would still live on in compounds and stuff. So that makes me want to say that this is the one that's going to mean, or something like to go. I need to think about that a little bit more. Which means that this yat form, when paired with the locative case, would mean to or toward. Whereas with the genitive, it would mean away from. And I'm going to say, essentially arbitrarily, that this mytin form means to leave or to depart, which therefore gives a postpositional meaning of from or out of, which overlaps with this form. So they could just be two ways of saying essentially the same thing. Like in English, we can use with for the instrumental or by for the instrumental as well. Or they could just be used in slightly different contexts. Or we could just refine the meaning of one of them, or just maybe even get rid of this one. I don't know. In any case, I don't think it's going to be a problem. And then just to give us a postposition that doesn't end in a T, say that this one means to use, and therefore that'll give us an instrumental postposition. And while we're at it, there is one other verb I want to decide on while I still remember. Because you may remember a while ago I said I'd quite like to have the word for to hate be formed from a verb that means to be sick with an applicative on it. Which admittedly I am basically stealing from Noun. But the equating of sickness and hatred is a really common thing cross-linguistically anyway. Like even in English, like the word mad can be used to mean either insane or angry. So it's a really common association, and just with the way that this language works, with the applicatives and everything, it just makes sense to do it. So then we need a base verb that means to be sick, and then we stick this directional il prefix to mean to be sick towards something. I think that would be the one that makes the most sense, especially considering the lexical source of to see. So I hate you would be I am sick seeing you. Yeah, I think that makes sense. And looking through these, I think this form, myklen, sounds the nicest as a word for to be sick. It's got some nice variety in the principal parts, and it just sounds good for it. And maybe it can have some other polysemous meanings well, maybe overlapping with just to be bad. Like, I'm pretty sure in Mandarin, the standard word for bad is huai, which also means rotten, I think. I might be misremembering that. But either way, going with muklen, meaning sick, then we stick the il prefix on it, and we get to hate. Cool. Well, I'd happily go on coining more verbs, but once again, time is conspiring against me. So in the little time that we have left, let's turn our attention away from verbs and back to nouns. So first of all, I expanded our declension chart out a bit. I split up the vowel stem endings into the 3 different vowels in the proto-lang, just because the vowel that ends the stem very often has a pretty defining effect on how the declension forms. Like looking at Latin, you can pretty much pin each of the declensions to a different sort of thematic vowel. So let's just start things off with an inanimate noun. I am tempted to try and fill this slot for the A-stem nouns. So one inanimate noun that we don't have yet is something like house, or I guess just building. Maybe it started out as a meaning of house in the proto-lang, and it's now just generalized to mean building. So I am once again cognizant of the fact that this word is very likely to be used later on in compounds, so deriving the names of particular types of buildings. Like, I don't know, like barracks could be something like soldier house, or palace could be something like ruling house, just off the top of my head. So we're looking for a phonological form that's relatively short and simple, and lends itself well to being combined with other forms. Let's try dukkha, which, since it's inanimate, will also have the I classifier ending, and that would give us these forms. Now, the I diphthong, we've said, becomes a long A vowel before codas, but this is not before a coda, this is at the end of a word. So I think we could justify that reducing to a single vowel. I really want to lose that vowel. I think I can justify that. One way or another, either we say that the inanimate class marker just supersedes the final vowel of the stem, or if the diphthong became reduced to a monophthong which gradually got whittled away. In fact, that's what we did down here for this form that means rock as well, because this form would have originally ended with a UI, although that did collapse into a short E. But whatever, I'm going to do the same thing here. Whereas here, that diphthong is protected because it's word internal, and diphthongs becoming long monophthongs happens before word final vowel loss, so this would not count as coming before a coda here. So how does that diphthong get reduced then, if at all? For now I'm just going to say it becomes an A monophthong. Inanimates have identical nominatives and locatives, so we don't have to worry about that one. So those then would be our forms, although in all 3 of these forms we could justify that A being an I. And in fact it would receive the stress, wouldn't it? Let me mark that in. And therefore if we did change the A to an I, that would cause umlaut in the preceding syllable. I'm going to keep it as an A for now, but I don't know. Okay, and now just to wrap up with another example sentence. Something that uses the words that we have made today. The bird from the tree hated the woman's house. And just so that we get to use those possessive classifiers, specifically the woman's house that she built herself. In fact, just so that we get to use a bit more variety in the auxiliary, let's make it a question, and let's also make it negative. Okay, so the subject is the bird. Bird in the nominative is mhynne, but it's specifically the bird from the tree, and that is a relative clause, the bird which was from the tree. Now we've said before that we can handle relativization of subject and object with just gapping, so that's fine. So then mhynne will be preceded by the adpositional phrase from the tree, which will consist of tree in the locative, which is the same as the nominative, which is usto. Or actually, would it be? because we could either use the to leave form or the to go form. I'm thinking that this one will just have a more general meaning of from. I don't know, I need to think about that some more. But we'll go with it for now, in which case the tree would not be in the locative, it would be in the genitive. And by genitive, I mean accusative, which used to be the genitive, but is now the accusative. You know what I mean. Or at least I hope you do. So that means the accusative of tree is ostos, with a long O. And then it's followed by the postposition yat, so that's the bird from the tree. Then we need the verb. The verb in this case, I think, will just be in the perfect. So the perfect is the third principal part combined with form 1 of the auxiliary. This is a negative sentence, so we can choose whether we want to use the actual negative auxiliary, or if we want to put the focus on the lexical verb by applying just the standard negative prefix. I'm going to go with the negative auxiliary, just because I think that one would be the sort of default. So it's form 1 of the auxiliary, and the bird from the tree is animate, singular. So the auxiliary is eure, but it's a yes or no question, which means we have to add the interrogative ending to the auxiliary. So it's euret. Then the lexical verb is to hate. We need the third principal part, which is ilmurek, but between the auxiliary and the lexical verb comes the direct object, which is the woman's house. So house in the accusative singular would be the casa, and then it's the woman's house, so we need the woman, but we need the woman in the nominative, because the way the possessive classifiers work, the possessor is actually the subject of the relative clause, and therefore would be in the nominative. So we just need sother, and between them we need the possessive classifier for accomplishments, or whatever you want to call it, which in the human singular is vanam. So stick that after the woman, and we get the final sentence, Ostos yat mihyn oirot sada vanam de kassa ilmyrok. Yeah, not bad, not bad. Okay, I'm going to have to call it there for today, but next time we will continue fleshing out our lexicon, assign some more meanings to these verbs, get some more nouns done, hopefully figure out what to do about the causative. So I will be back hopefully fairly soon for that, and I look forward to seeing you then. Thanks for watching.